My name is Sloan Hastings, and I am 34 years old. And 6 months ago, I walked into the offices of Harbor Real Estate Group in downtown Boston, and I signed a contract to purchase a waterfront restaurant called the Maritime for $1.8 million cash. And the real estate agent said, "This is a beautiful property. Are you planning to run it yourself?" And I said, "No, I'm planning to get married there." And she said, "Oh, how lovely." And I said, "My wedding is in October." And she said, "Wonderful." And I said, "And I need you to contact the current owner and cancel a reservation they have on file for October 12th. And she pulled up the booking system and she said there's a private event scheduled that day, a wedding reception, for a Miss Vanessa Hartwell. And I said, "I know." And she said, "Should I offer them an alternative date?" And I said, "No, just cancel it." And she looked uncomfortable and said, "Ms. Hastings, they've already put down a $20,000 deposit." And I said, "I'm aware. And I'm buying the entire restaurant, so the deposit doesn't matter." And she said, and I said, "I didn't destroy Vanessa's wedding, I just bought the venue. And what happened after that wasn't my fault. It was gravity." Let me take you back, because this didn't start with a real estate purchase. This started 4 years ago when I was 30 years old, and I was dating a woman named Vanessa Hartwell who came from old money in Connecticut, and I was a software developer, making $72,000 a year and trying to save enough to start my own company, and Vanessa and I had been together for 2 years. And I thought we were happy until the night she took me to dinner at the Maritime, which was her favorite restaurant, and she ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than my rent. And halfway through the meal, she said, "Sloan, I need to talk to you about something." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "I don't think this is working." And I said, "What isn't working?" And she said, "Us." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because you're not where I need you to be." And I said, "Where do you need me to be?" And she said, "Financially." And I went very still. And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "Sloan, my friends are all marrying, people who can afford to live a certain way, and you can't." And I said, "I'm building something, Vanessa. I'm saving to launch my own company." And she said, "I know, and that's very ambitious, but I can't wait around to see if it works out." And I said, "So, you're leaving me because I'm not rich?" And she said, "I'm leaving you because you're too poor to fit in with my friends." And she stood up and she left and she stuck me with the $400 check. I sat at that table for a long time after she left, and I looked around the Maritime, and I looked at the water outside the windows, and I thought about the fact that Vanessa had just ended a 2-year relationship over dinner. Because I didn't make enough money, and I didn't cry, I didn't get angry, I just thought very clearly that one day I would come back to this restaurant, and it would be mine, and Vanessa would know it, and it wouldn't matter anymore, but I'd still want her to know. I spent the next 3 years working harder than I'd ever worked in my life. I launched my software company with 2 partners, and we built a project management platform for small creative businesses. And it was slow at first. We barely broke even the first year, and I lived in a studio apartment, and I ate ramen 4 nights a week, and I didn't go out, and I didn't date, and I put everything I had into making the company work. And in year 2, we started to grow. We got our first big client, and then another. And by the end of year 2, we had 40 clients and revenue of $800,000. And I was paying myself $60,000 a year, which was less than I made as a developer, but I didn't care because I owned a third of the company, and the company was growing. In year 3, we got acquired by a larger tech firm for $12 million, and I walked away with $4 million after taxes. And I sat in my studio apartment the day the money hit my account, and I stared at my bank balance, and I didn't feel rich. I just felt like I'd survived, and the first thing I did was move into a better apartment. And the second thing I did was start looking at real estate. And the third thing I did was go on a dating app because I was 33 and I was tired of being alone. I matched with a woman named Lily who was a graphic designer, and she was funny and kind, and she didn't ask me what I did for a living on the first date. She asked me what made me happy, and I said, "I don't know anymore." And she said, "Then we should figure it out." And we did, and 6 months later, I asked her to marry me. And she said, yes. And I said, where do you want to get married? And she said, I don't care, as long as it's with you. And I said, what if I said I wanted to get married at a specific place? And she said, then we'll get married there. And I said, even if it's expensive. And she said, Sloan, I don't care about expensive, I care about you. And I realized I'd spent 2 years with someone who cared about money and 6 months with someone who cared about me. And the difference was everything. I started looking into buying the Maritime, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the memory of that dinner to belong to something better. And I called the owner and I asked if the property was for sale. And he said it wasn't on the market, but everything's for sale if the price is right. And I said, name your price. And he said 1.8 million. And I said, I'll pay cash. And he said, when do you want to close? And I said, as soon as possible. And he said, give me 60 days. And I said, done. And I didn't tell Lily why I wanted that specific venue. I just said it was special to me. And she said, okay. 2 weeks after I made the offer, I was scrolling through social media and I saw that Vanessa had gotten engaged to a man named Trevor Wainwright, who I recognized as the son of a hedge fund manager, and Vanessa's ring was the size of a small planet. And the comments on her post were full of people saying congratulations and how perfect they were, and I didn't feel jealous. I felt nothing. And then I saw a tagged photo from 3 days earlier, and it was Vanessa and Trevor at the Maritime, and the caption said, celebrating our engagement at our favorite spot. Can't wait to have our wedding here next fall. And I stared at that photo for a long time. And I realized Vanessa had booked her wedding at the same restaurant where she dumped me for being poor. And I didn't plan what happened next. I didn't scheme. I just let the purchase go through. 60 days later, I became the owner of the Maritime, and the manager called me and said, congratulations, Ms. Hastings. We're excited to work with you. And I said, I'm excited too. And he said, we have your wedding on the books for October 19th. And I said, actually, I'd like to move it to October 12th. And he said, let me check the system. And he paused and he said, we have a private event that day, a wedding reception. And I said, cancel it. And he said, Ms. Hastings, they've put down a significant deposit. And I said, I own the restaurant now and I'm telling you to cancel it. And he said, I'll need to contact them. And I said, do what you need to do, and I hung up. 3 days later, Vanessa called me. I hadn't heard her voice in almost 4 years. And she said, Sloan and I said, Vanessa. And she said, I just got a call from the Maritime saying our wedding reservation has been canceled. And I said, okay. And she said, did you do this? And I said, I bought the restaurant. And she said, you what? And I said, I bought it. And I'm getting married there in October. And she went silent. And then she said, you bought an entire restaurant just to cancel my wedding. And then I said, no, Vanessa, I bought an entire restaurant because I wanted to get married there and your reservation was in the way. And she said, this is insane. And I said, what's insane is that you dumped me at that restaurant 4 years ago because I was too poor to fit in with your friends. And now I own it. And she said, Sloan, this is petty. And I said, it's real estate. And I hung up. I didn't do anything else. I didn't call her again. I didn't post about it. I just let the information exist. And I watched what happened next. And what happened next was a chain reaction. I didn't start. I just removed one piece. And everything else fell on its own. Vanessa tried to rebook at other venues, but it was 8 months before her wedding, and every comparable venue was already booked, and she ended up having to choose between a hotel ballroom or a country club an hour outside the city, and she chose the country club. And I know this because one of her bridesmaids posted about how stressful the venue change had been and how Vanessa was handling it with such grace. Then Vanessa's engagement photos came out, and someone commented asking if they were still getting married at the Maritime, and Vanessa replied, no, we had to change venues, and someone else asked why. And Vanessa said the owner sold the restaurant. And the new owner needed the date. And someone said, that's terrible. And someone else said, wait, didn't you say that was your favorite restaurant? And Vanessa said it was. And someone said, so why didn't the new owner let you keep the date? And Vanessa didn't respond. But someone who knew someone who worked at the Maritime commented and said, I heard the new owner bought the place specifically so she could get married there, and she needed that exact date. And someone else said that's kind of crazy. And the thread kept going, and people started speculating, and someone eventually connected the dots and said, wait, isn't the new owner Sloane Hastings, the woman who sold her company for millions? And someone said, I think she used to date Vanessa. And the thread exploded. I didn't participate. I didn't comment. I didn't clarify. I just let people talk. And the more they talked, the more the story grew. And it went from I bought a restaurant to ruin Vanessa's wedding, and Vanessa started getting messages from people asking if it was true, and she denied it. But the denial made it worse because people started asking what really happened, and why would someone spend almost $2 million just to cancel a wedding? And Vanessa couldn't answer that without admitting she dumped me for being poor, so she just stopped responding. Then Trevor's mother got involved, and I know this because Vanessa's maid of honor posted a very vague story about how some people don't understand that love is more important than petty grudges, and Trevor's mother commented saying she was glad. Someone understood, and Vanessa replied with a heart emoji. And I realized that Trevor's family was starting to question Vanessa's judgment, and that had nothing to do with me. That was just people seeing a pattern of chaos and wondering if it was worth it. 3 weeks before Vanessa's wedding, I got married at the Maritime, and it was perfect. And Lily cried during the vows, and we danced by the windows overlooking the water. And I didn't think about Vanessa once during the entire night. I just thought about the fact that I was marrying someone who loved me when I had nothing and still loved me when I had something, and that was worth more than any venue. Vanessa's wedding happened 3 weeks later at the country club, and I didn't go, obviously, but I saw photos, and it looked fine. It looked like every other country club wedding, and I felt nothing. And then 2 months after her wedding, Vanessa's marriage started falling apart, I know, because Trevor's sister posted something cryptic about how some people marry for the wrong reasons, and Vanessa unfollowed her, and then 6 months after the wedding, Vanessa and Trevor separated, and I heard through mutual acquaintances that Trevor's family had never approved of Vanessa, and the venue drama had been the beginning of a long list of things that made them think she wasn't right for their family, and I didn't cause that I just removed. A venue and everything else was already unstable. It just needed one thing to shift. I didn't destroy Vanessa. I didn't ruin her life. I just bought a restaurant. And the rest of it, the lost venue, the social media spiral, the family tension, the failed marriage. All of that was already there. I just pushed the first domino, and I didn't even push it hard. I just bought something I wanted, and it happened to be something she needed. And when she lost it, everything else that was barely holding together came apart. And that wasn't my revenge, that was just consequence. If you've ever been told you're not good enough because of your bank account, if you've ever been left by someone who valued your net worth more than your worth, I need you to know this. You don't have to destroy people who underestimate you. You just have to build something they can't ignore. And sometimes the best revenge is just living well in a place they thought they owned and watching them realize they never did. And you don't have to gloat. You don't have to explain. You just have to let gravity do its job, because people who build their lives on shallow foundations don't need you to knock them down. They just need one thing to shift, and the whole structure collapses on its own.